Today, our speaker is Dr. Benjamin Schewel, who is a fellow at the Center for Religion, Conflict, and the Public Domain at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and an affiliate scholar at the Institution for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, where he also got his undergraduate degree. He has worked for the Baha'i International Community's European Office as a research and policy officer. He got his PhD in philosophy from Leuven, KU, I think stands for Royal University in Dutch, if I remember right. And he's also been a visiting professor at universities at Oxford, Cambridge, Utrecht, and Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. His research has concentrated on questions concerning religion and history. His book, 7 Ways of Looking at Religion, was published by Yale University Press 2 years ago. He's currently working away on a book about titled Encountering the Axial Age, which looks at this period of time in the history of civilization in Eurasia when there was quite a lot of remarkable change, and the whole question of whether we're in an axial age today, which is a fascinating question. And of course, he's also edited this book that he'll talk about today. So with no further ado, let me introduce Ben Schewel. Ben, thank you for joining us today, and I will turn all of this over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob, and thank you for all of you who are watching this presentation. Just wanted to make one slight correction as we begin. Rob had said that I co-authored the book with Jeff Cameron, who's up in Canada, and technically where I am in the Netherlands, I think Toronto would be down. So, you know, it's a very unique thing to say down in Canada, but I'm going to be very happy to say that right now, that I co-authored the book with Jeff Cameron, who's down in Canada. So I thought, you know, for those of you, we can see, I guess you probably saw at some point there's a picture of this book, Religion and Public Discourse in the Age of Transition, Reflections on Bahá'í Practice and Thought. So it's a collection of essays, but in many ways, it functions very differently than many other collections, which is to say, it is a coherent book. There's a structure, there's an argument, there's a sequence of thoughts. All of the chapters were collectively edited by the authors, were refined quite extensively by the various authors. And we went through this very sort of rigorous process of revision and coordination and reflection. There were some additional chapters that were there that were then cut, and then they sort of merged into another chapter. There were some authors who were planning to contribute, but then later that evolved and it became clear that maybe the subject that they were thinking about wouldn't fit the argument of the volume. So I think the first thing to say is that, you know, though it is a collection of essays by different authors, it is a coherent book. And I think there's something very purposeful about that. I mean, in a way, if one part of what gave impetus to this book was a thought, well, what if there's a slightly different way to generate work, generate scholarship, generate sort of profound thought by a variety of different people with different specializations, but then to get beyond this kind of, you know, just sort of a smattering of different ideas and to have something really coherent that was there. So one thing that was behind this whole process was a certain method. And it's not to sort of make grandiose claims about that method. It was a very modest step, but nevertheless, it was a step. And some principles became clear, experience was gained, and it seems that at least for those authors who are involved in that, and for some other people who have been thinking about the book, studying it, reflecting on it, how might they take up certain lines of inquiry that were presented in the book, extend them, you know, introduce new lines of inquiry. It's a step that hopefully many other steps will come from and take the same question and the same process much further. I mean, even just sort of a broader reflection, if you think about some of the real advances in the hard sciences over the last couple generations, it's been this movement towards collective research in which there are many authors on a single paper. And in the social sciences and humanities, to some extent, that has sort of picked up. But in a way, what you see here is also us beginning to explore the process of how is it that a coherent research project amongst a variety of different thinkers can emerge, and one that's shaped by the experiences of the Baha'i faith and the sort of the Baha'i teachings and the collective insights of the Baha'i community. So at a broad level, that was the kind of setup for this book. I guess more proximately, the thought to do a book like this came from two sources. One was a few people were just sort of reflecting on this Baha'i study series at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And for those of you who are familiar with that series, you would know that Nadir Sa'idi's Gate of the Heart was the first volume published in that series. And so a few people were just looking at that and were thinking, well, this is such a unique opportunity to have a series like this, but it's basically just sat dormant for, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. So then the thought would be, well, how could that process, that opportunity, that opening, how could we sort of enliven it again and begin to use it? So that first thought was just to kind of come up with an idea. And so Jeff and I happened to be in a meeting, I think we were in London, and in between some sort of sessions, we were going around and walking, and we were just thinking of some ideas. Well, what could we do this? What could we do that? And both of us from our various disciplines, me coming from more philosophy and religious studies, and Jeff more from political science and history, begin to realize that there was this really unique, moment in the broader academic discourse on religion and public discourse. And this was happening through a lot of different concepts: religion in the public sphere, debates about secularization and the post-secular, questions about public religion or the deprivatization of religion. It was just everywhere we looked in our various fields, people were talking about the resurgence of religion in public life, the enduring importance of religion in public life, sort of questions about what would a new normative framework be for thinking about the role that religion should play in public life. A normative framework that isn't built upon the assumptions of classical secularization theory, that sees religion as having a potential sort of very positive role to play, a distinctive role, and just somehow realizing that this debate had emerged really in the last few years and was reaching kind of like a fever pitch. And it just felt like that was an opening for a group of Baha'is who have various sort of fields of expertise that all in one way or another relate to the question of religion and public discourse and religion and public life. And so we sort of came up with an idea of what this book could look like or what this topic would be. And one of the terms that we ended up using a lot was this term post-secular. And it's sort of one of these jargony sounding words that is jargon. It is in kind of academic jargon, but it has a certain youthfulness in the broader conversation on religion and public life, which is to say, most people recognize that there is something about particularly modern Western civilization, and then those other societies that are trying to model themselves on the modern West, that is secular. Now, what specifically it means for it to be secular is unclear. But there's also this feeling that something about the secularity of modern Western civilization in particular has in recent years been brought into doubt. And so it's unclear the role that secularity will play in our emerging global society. It's unclear the role that liberal norms of secularism, of Western ideals, of secularism, of aspirations of a kind of irreligious future that have been present in sociology and philosophy of history for hundreds of years, what role all of that will play in the future. And so the term that people have come up with just to refer to this kind of swirling world of conversation that's just kind of confused about the nature of secularism, the limits of secularism, the possibilities of secularism, but somehow is also clear that whatever role religion is going to play in the future, it's going to be prominent, and it's going to be public, and it's going to be enduring. The term that people have used to start naming that sort of growing discourse is post-secular. So then we took this term post-secular and we saw it as sort of an invitation to make a contribution to this burgeoning discourse about the role of religion in our emerging global society. So that was the sort of the premise. And as we sort of talked about that premise, it started to sound attractive. It was simple, it was profound, it invited a wide range of possible insights. It crystallized a certain discourse that we were sort of already having in the Baha'i community, but then it connected it to another very powerful discourse that was happening throughout society, not just in academia, but also in policy-making circles, amongst public intellectuals. And as we shared it with some other people, there would also seem to be some enthusiasm for pursuing it. Obviously understanding that the word post-secular is a limited concept, an academic concept. And so as we kind of carried on, we had to really think, well, how much do we want to use the term post-secular? How much do we not want to use the term post-secular? How do we sort of connect ourselves to these theoretical discourses without taking their concepts on and then sort of projecting them onto the Baha'i faith? But at the same time, how do we not kind of demand this radical purity from all scientific or philosophical concepts and draw insight from them that illumines aspects of our experience and teachings? I mean, anyone who's familiar with some of the work that the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity has been doing, who's been reading some of the, publications like Revelation and Social Reality, I mean, these questions should be familiar to them. But we were just asking them, in the context of trying to produce content that could be engaged by, an audience that's used to reading scholarly manuscripts. So in the same way the Baha'i international community would have to think about its contribution to, European Union or United Nations discourse, what are the characteristics of that? How is it that, insight can be drawn from the existing discourse, but also insights from the faith can be brought in? We were asking that question a bit more pointedly in relationship to scholarship. And so then as Jeff and I began to kind of come up with a list of potential authors, we approached the idea, we shared the idea with them, it took on further shape, reflections emerged, and we sort of came to an initial list of contributors. And we decided that if we were going to do something, if it was worth going through the effort of producing a book, it would probably be worth taking the effort to also think about the characteristics of that book and to not just sort of slap something together and send it out for publication, but to really think long and hard about what the characteristics of such a book would be, how it would be produced, what would be the nature of its contribution, what balances would it strive to achieve. And so we had a first meeting. I think it was in West Palm Beach, which is not the worst place in the world to have a meeting. It was very pleasant, in fact. And there's some of these questions that I was just mentioning. We were hashing them out. We were wondering about them. And it sounds kind of simple when I say it now, but it took us in many ways that whole meeting to reach the conclusion that there were certain people whose sort of natural inclination, whether probably because of their professional location within the academy or as a graduate student, was to sort of immerse themselves in a discourse, an academic discourse, and then to show how insights from the Baha'i teachings or the collective experience of the Baha'i community could sort of illumine or shape or kind of contribute to that discourse in one way or another. And then there were another group of people who were more, perhaps because of their kind of being more situated within the kind of institutional life of the Baha'i community, or who some of their work has been more about producing content that helps the Baha'i community in its own educational initiatives, tended to be more situated in the kind of the discourse that the Baha'i community would be having, but at a level of intellectual sophistication. And then to sort of acknowledge and draw some insights from wider scholarly conversations that could then illumine the kind of ongoing conversation that might be taking place within the intellectual life of the Baha'i community. And again, I said it sounds very simple, but if you think about it, there are certain complexities involved, which is to say, well, what are the standards of sort of argumentation that we would consider to be acceptable for such a book? Are we going to kind of take on certain assumptions of kind of the social sciences and the humanities and feel the burden of proof if we disagree with those assumptions, if we introduce other assumptions, if we begin, for example, from the assumption that, human beings are fundamentally spiritual in nature, that there is spiritual dimensions to reality, that we can learn about those through revelation, that through our efforts to translate those insights into reality, spiritual forces are released, that, crystallize in new patterns of thought, institutions, forms of civilization. If that's one of our guiding assumptions, do we have to argue for it? Or can we just assume it? Or would some people argue for it and other people just assume it? And if we're assuming it, is there something sort of non-scholarly about that? would that mean that we couldn't publish with the university press, that then we should go with a Baha'i press? Or should we just kind of do it and then see, not really worry about it too much? And so there were a lot of conversations that happened about that. And the solution we reached, again, it was a fairly sort of unprofound, but nevertheless it proved effective for our purposes, was that we should sort of strive so that the more academically oriented papers are fully coherent with the framework, the overarching conceptual framework that shapes the practice and the thought and the conversations of the Baha'i community. But it may be okay for those articles to be either a little bit less explicit about that framework or to kind of present some argumentation for it, sort of assuming that there was a bit more oriented to an academic audience. So it would be sort of a more academic paper that was then coherent with the broader framework of the faith. On the other hand, then those who were more writing from within the kind of ongoing conversations of the Baha'i community, and then would also be sort of using those frameworks kind of more explicitly, they should write in such a way that those who might be coming to this book and not be as deeply familiar with that framework or coming from an academic perspective would be able to see that the sophistication sort of warranted serious consideration. That just by sort of the rigor of our thought, the clarity of our argumentation, sort of the modesty of our proposals, but nevertheless our own kind of confidence in our assumptions, that it should sort of, have the sort of the aura of intellectual seriousness. And so that was sort of, it's a very simple, not profound sort of balance we came to, but nevertheless it allowed us to produce this book. And really the conversations beforehand were quite extensive, a lot of hand-wringing. Well, should this person be in? Should they not be in? Should they write like this? Should that person write like that? And somehow we reached this kind of conclusion. And it's like just this idea that some are facing more towards, let's say, the academy, and some are facing a bit more towards the Baha'i community, but they're also drawing insight from the academy, but that somehow we're still standing within the same circle. And that there might be subtly different norms that express themselves in our writing and the people that we're engaging, but somehow just to see ourselves as standing in a circle and perhaps facing in slightly different ways. So the other then interesting thought that kind of took shape was that if you sort of look at a discourse on religion or you look at like the idea of religion and public discourse, there are obviously many dimensions to publicness. You think of what are the prevalent discourses of society. You could form a list, as long as tall as the wall that I'm looking at. I mean, you just think, well, there's education, there's science, there's art, there's technology, there's politics, there's scholarship. Within scholarship, there's, infinite dimensions. There's media, there's popular culture, there's, fiction. The list just sort of goes on of the things that people are talking about in public life. And there are different layers in which they're talking. They're talking in the street, they're talking at the park, they're talking at the coffee shop, they're talking at their offices, they're talking in social media, they're talking in sort of news media, they're talking in magazines, they're talking in blogs, they're talking in books, they're talking in debates, there are all sorts of just sort of things that are happening. And someone to realize that public discourse is just this vast horizon of possibilities and conversations. And then all the themes that they're engaging. And so one of the sort of the guiding principles we used when trying to think about who the authors might be was we thought about someone who had really sort of, advanced for one reason or another quite far in their understanding and kind of engagement with one prevalent dimension of the ongoing discourses of society. So, obviously education is a big facet of the public discourse. How do we think about education? What role does education play in preparing people for public discourse? Obviously science is a major conception, questions about science and religion. Obviously media, civil society, sort of our understanding of where we are in history was also a concept that emerged, that somehow when we speak in public, there's all these background concepts about what's happening in the world, where are we coming from. And so we kind of came to a number of chapters that really dealt with some of those core themes about religion and public life. Obviously, there are other themes that could have been considered, but as I was mentioning, the ones that we really sort of came to were history, questions of civil society, media, education, and science and religion. And somehow religion is a part of all those different themes, but and these were kind of more conceptual pieces in a way. And this was sort of more, questions about, well, what insights from the revelation or ideas can sort of shift our understanding or relationship to certain of these, important facets of public conversations, or sort of these deep concepts that undergird the conversations that are taking place in contemporary society. And then from there was sort of a shift in tone. And that was more where it was less looking explicitly at sort of the insights the Baha'i community could bring to our understanding of these sort of core concepts or sort of structures that are shaping public discourse, to more, well, what are the actual experiences of the Baha'i community in contributing to public discourse? And what are the methods that have animated those experiences? What were the results? What are some of the spaces? And there we had a number of other chapters that emerged. One was sort of more thinking about the kind of the methods and history of the Baha'i community's participation in public discourse. Another was looking at the Baha'i community's involvement in international development discourse. Another was looking at the Baha'i international community at the United Nations. And a third was the refugee resettlement program from 1981 to 1989. And it's interesting that if you look at chapter 9, which was Jeff's chapter, and you look at chapter 1, which is my chapter, sort of you can see them as kind of limit cases in a way, which is to say that my chapter was dealing with one of these core concepts that's in the background of all public discourse, which is just sort of the vision of history that shapes our sense of what's happening in the world today, where we're going, what's happening with religion, what's the future hold, what does it not hold. And Jeff's chapter gets us to the point where we're just sort of at the edge of public discourse and really thinking about policy. And obviously one of the goals of our contribution to public discourse is to shape policy. And sort of the way we do that is part of it. But still, in a way, sort of you could imagine a whole other range of questions that emerge when we're thinking about the question of policy and law and other things like that per se. So it's sort of mine kind of begins with philosophy of history, kind of philosophy of where we're heading in human history. And Jeff's is more sort of the shaping of public policy. And somehow in between that, there's sort of a range of concepts from the sort of very philosophical and abstract to kind of the much more practically oriented about shaping policy and law. And within that, there's a whole range of different ideas that are presented. So I'm not going to presume to speak on behalf of the authors who penned the other 8 chapters in the book, partially because they are far more knowledgeable about the subjects that they presented than I am myself. So in that regard, I would just encourage you to read the book, get your hands on it. There are some really wonderful essays in there, some research that just hasn't been presented anywhere else. I think the concepts are really unique, and some of those you can find in some slight other places. But to have all of those concepts articulated so clearly, and then to have this just really cutting-edge research on what the Baha'i community has actually done in various moments of its history, how it shapes public policy, how it's contributing to public discourse, how it's contributing to these various conversations at the UN and international development. It's just very, really wonderful essays in there, and I would encourage you all to take a look at it. But I think, so in many ways, the book is, and we intended it to be a beginning. It's sort of an invitation to a conversation, an invitation to a path of inquiry that can and should continue to unfold in the future decades. And that concepts will evolve, social reality will evolve, our understanding will advance, the reality of the Baha'i community will advance, and obviously that conversation will kind of become more complex and nuanced, and maybe different concepts and terms and principles and everything will emerge. But nevertheless, I think we had this feeling that, the time is right to take a step forward in the intellectual life of the Baha'i community. And that, there may have been, that to have people that are producing content and really thinking about that. And thinking about that in a way, obviously we've always had, interested Baha'is who've generated excellent pieces of scholarship or written articles or publications. So there's nothing new about that, obviously. But I think what is new is trying to strive for a certain coherence with the methods and principles that have shaped the Baha'i community's work and expansion and consolidation, and increasingly through offices of external affairs in the Baha'i international community, our participation in public discourse, not to mention various fields of social action, to take all those principles and those ideas and those methods that have been over years refined in these other spaces and start to apply it to the generation of scholarship. And scholarship that doesn't just, when we say the word scholarship, we're not just saying, things that professors at universities are going to, like. I mean, in a way, it's a term that's used, and it's a term that we're going to have to redefine. It's not something that, this person has a PhD, they are a scholar. This person doesn't have a PhD, they're not a scholar. This person cites 100 sources. This person doesn't cite 100 sources. The one is a scholar, the other is not. Obviously, we're talking about something different, something more. We don't fully know what that looks like. But so that's why it just sort of takes not just, obviously individuals to work on it, but groups of people to begin thinking about it and to really go through that painstaking process of trying to articulate work and methods and publications that take modest steps toward the eventual creation of establishment of an intellectual form of intellectuality within which a sort of astoundingly rich and illuminating and productive form of scholarship and publication streams, and it's coherent with the broader life of the Baha'i community. It's also very in touch with the reality of the world. I mean, it's a future vision, but we have to begin thinking about it. And this was just one modest attempt of a few friends to start working on a project like that. So yeah, I think maybe then instead of just kind of going through the chapters one by one or anything like that, it might be, I think, the conversation, I could present more on that, and maybe if Rob has certain questions about that, we can do that, but we also thought it might be nice to have maybe a little bit longer of a conversation than perhaps in some other instances, partially because, I authored 1/9 of this book, and so there's only so much that I can talk about it.
That's true. Thanks, Ben, for this sort of opening summary of the situation of the book and sort of how it came into existence. And I suspect a lot of people are still sort of swimming in all the details, which are really quite fascinating. One thing that I wanted to ask about, you had mentioned all the different dimensions of public discourse, the sort of different kinds of publicnesses of public discourse. And I'm wondering if you've done any thinking about how Baha'is locally can be involved in public discourse. This is not, of course, the focus of your book, but it'd be, I think, helpful for our audience to think about ways they themselves can do public discourse. And have you any suggestions or ideas about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, there's a few things that I can say. The first is that public discourse isn't some like mystical thing, and only when you're doing certain things are you in public discourse, and then in other spaces you're not. I mean, you think about like in the sort of the simplest way, if you think of private life, there's like the conversation in your family or something like that, or in these sort of more small scale kind of communities. Again, we're not going to draw a fast distinction, but just for the sake of this kind of conversation. And then like you step outside and you start talking to people and you're in public, you're in public life and you're having conversations. And this could be conversations with your neighbors, with kids at the park, with community workers. And then like there are layers and layers and layers of conversation. So, I don't know, you go and present a position piece before the European Parliament. That's sort of that's a space of public discourse. Or there's a bunch of guys sitting in the park talking about how the park has fallen apart and why is that, and then you go and you're talking about that, and then in a way you're involved in public discourse. Or you've got your junior youth group, and then suddenly you're now interacting with social workers who are also working and thinking about the neighborhood, and you're invited to a space with a lot of other actors who are talking about, well, what's going to happen in the neighborhood, what are our projects, how do we work together. You're involved in public discourse. So I think in a way it's just something that you're drawn into inevitably, and most people are already engaged in it in one form or another. And so I guess it's just being a little bit more deliberate about thinking about the conversations we're engaged in. And then as naturally doors open for us to get involved in other spaces, we just have to think about those spaces. And somehow it's also like this book is like a few people found themselves in these academic spaces or engaged at least with certain kinds of academic conversations, and then thought, well, let's think about the conversation we're having in this space of public discourse. And what do we want to say? And what do we not want to say? And how do we want to say it? And who are the people that are helpful conversation partners? And so it's not so different than thinking, well, okay, we're at this neighborhood and there's this organization and then there's this guy and then there's this person and who's kind of someone we can work together with, and I really like what they're doing, it's interesting, and maybe we could bring this aspect, somehow it's just not so different in a way.
Right. It's basically a form of significant conversation that we're supposed to be engaged in all the time.
Right. And some people happen to write books and to sort of use citations, and so at some point you start saying the word scholarship, but it doesn't become this kind of like, I don't know, this like discourse, and then what is it? It's like, well, it is pretty simple. It's just there's a range of complexity that when you think about all the possible spaces and subjects, it gets really, really complex.
Shahla asked about the publisher, Wilfrid Laurier Press, and perhaps you might want to say a little something about Wilfrid Laurier and the series, because you mentioned the series, but perhaps you should elaborate upon that a bit more so people are more aware of it.
Yeah, so Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Wilfrid Laurier University is a Canadian university. Wilfrid Laurier University Press is a press associated with the university. They publish academic manuscripts. It's one of the quite good Canadian presses. And I don't know the specifics of it, but basically the Association for Baha'i Studies established a relationship with them with the publication of this book by Nader Saidi, The Gate of the Heart, which was a study of the writings of the Bab. And they did it through the establishing of Baha'i Studies series. And so for years, The Gate of the Heart was the only book published in that series. And at a certain point, a few people were just thinking about, well, seems reasonable to publish a second book. I mean, why have a series if you have one book? And so then this is what emerged sort of out of that. And I think there are a couple other in the works now. I'm not sure exactly. I think Michael Collerberg is writing a book that might be the next one in the series. So hopefully this will take shape and become a lively thing, and sort of show the range. And I think it's also an interesting thing in a way. It's like there's a book on the writings of the Bab, and then there's a book on public discourse, and it's somehow like helping us as a community to realize, like when we say Baha'i scholarship or Baha'i studies, like the study of the writings and the history of the faith is a part of that, but then there's also just worlds and worlds and worlds of other forms of scholarship and research and intellectual activity that have to emerge and now are starting to emerge. And just somehow this is, when we say Baha'i studies or the Association for Baha'i Studies, we're talking about a whole world, not just sort of like study of the faith as an object, but also we're not talking about that, because that happens and it's important and it needs to keep happening. And so it's just, I think, it's sort of a nice thing that these are the first two books. One is a study of the faith, the other is a collection that just shows the sort of infinite richness that can come by taking the insights and experiences of the Baha'i community and applying them in other areas.
Gary asks about the reception. First of all, the audience has reached the reception so far, and has the conversation continued among the authors?
Yeah, I would say the reception, I mean, you can't really kid yourself too much. Probably most of the people who read this book are Baha'is. I mean, obviously there are some who aren't. It gets picked up by a lot of different libraries, but
Sure.
at this particular moment, the primary readership for such a book is going to be, the Baha'i community. And within that community, my sense is that the reception has been very positive.
Sure.
Obviously, I haven't spoken to everybody who's read it. I've been a part of a few meetings where some people talked about the book, reflected on it, and not just in a way of sort of studying it, though that would happen, but thinking about how the kind of process that led to a book like this could be extended, and not just perhaps lead to another book, but I don't know, whole research programs or whole evolving areas of inquiry. What would that be and how would that work? And sort of just like unleashing that possibility of kind of doing new things. And I think, the reception has been quite high and quite good amongst the people, at least I've interacted with, who read it. And I think, there has been an ongoing conversation amongst the authors, though I think, in a way, part of the nature of that conversation is that more things have blossomed in a way. So, for example, like David Palmer and I, who's the author of the second chapter, we're now working on another project together. And that sort of emerged directly out of the book project. And so, I'm going to be going up to China for a couple weeks in April, and we're going to start sort of more systematically thinking about what that would look like. I know there's a couple other authors who kind of, people who were thinking about education, who are down in Canada, I'll say again, but who've been thinking about that process and advancing there. And right. So there's a lot of stuff happening in a way, and I think it's just exciting because, like I said, the whole book is just meant to be a step. I mean, not the definitive words, not now something that everyone has to kind of frame everything they do in terms of this book, but it's just something. And then hopefully there's more something that happens, but that at least is building upon the methods and the insights and the experience of an effort such as this.
Good. How much is the book?
I think it comes in at about 30 Canadian. Should be then in the 20s US dollars. It's available through, the Association for Baha'i Studies website. I think you can also get it on other major booksellers, Amazon, Book Depository, things.
Yep. Yeah, someone asked why is the book expensive, but that's not necessarily expensive nowadays, considering the cost of producing books, and the volume, obviously, of sales also sets the price as well. They have to guess how many they're going to sell to cover the cost of editing.
Yeah.
So.
And I think this was also sort of a question of, working with various publishers. I mean, there's a certain advantage to publishing with the university press in that there's a certain perception of legitimacy. Now, the question is, how valuable is that perception? And that was a debate we had. Should we just publish with the American Baha'i Publishing Service? Or would that be more useful? Maybe we could have a different price, wider distribution. But I guess somehow we thought that with this, with the Association of Baha'i Studies, though, somehow we don't want to limit what we mean when we say the word sort of scholarship or intellectual activity to what happens at universities. We don't also want to radically detach it from it. And so to have this opening, to have this kind of this book series with a good press like Wilfrid Laurier University Press, that there would be some use to developing that and to seeing where it takes us. But yeah, I think that's one of the limits of working with the university press is as Rob mentioned, the pricing is a little bit different.
Yeah, someone has said it's $35 on Amazon, but what can you do? If you want to buy many journals, you have to spend $30-40 just to get a single issue of the journal nowadays. And if you want to subscribe to a journal, it costs $100 a year to subscribe to a journal. Can you perhaps mention some of the names of the chapters and the people who wrote them so people have a better idea of the content?
Sure. We have Chapter 1 is my chapter, Religion in an Age of Transition. Chapter 2 is by David Palmer, who is a professor of sociology or anthropology, or perhaps both, at the University of Hong Kong. His chapter is called Religion, Spiritual Principles, and Civil Society. Chapter 3 is by Michael Carlberg, who teaches at the University of Western Washington, Media and Public Discourse. Chapter 4 is by Sona Farid Arbab, who worked for many years at the Office of Social and Economic Development, education and moral empowerment, raising capacity for participation in public discourse. Chapter 5 is written by Farzam Arbab, who served for many years in the Universal House of Justice, and before that at Fundayak, which was a development organization in Colombia, an inquiry into the harmony of science and religion. Chapter 6 is by Mr. Shahryar Razavi, who's a current member of the Universal House of Justice. Baha'i participation in public discourse, some considerations related to history, concepts, and approaches. Chapter 7, Contributions to International Development Discourse, Exploring the Roles of Science and Religion, by Matthew Weinberg, who now is, I believe, the director of the Baha'i Internet Agency, and before was, I think, the director of the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity.
Right.
Chapter 8, A New Politics of Engagement, the Baha'i International Community, the United Nations, and Gender Equality, by Julia Berger, who, many congratulations to her, just finished her PhD from the University of Canada, and worked for many years before at the Baha'i International Community United Nations Office. Chapter 9 by Jeffrey Cameron, who also, congratulations to him, just finished his PhD at the University of Toronto. The just is a somewhat relative term, and now is working for the Office of External Affairs for the Canadian Baha'i Community. His chapter is The Baha'i Community and Public Policy, the Baha'i Refugee Resettlement Program, 1981 to 1989. So yeah, very diverse group of chapters, very diverse authors with different experiences, and yeah, so it's a really rich publication.
Mm-hmm. One person asked, what do you think we can learn for the development of Wilman Institute and its courses from the book? One of our science and religion faculty asks that question, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the first level, like anyone can learn from any publication. It's just what is the content that it presents, and insofar as the arguments and sort of the research presented in the book is sound and interesting and presents novel ideas, it's something that everyone can learn from, and there may be some relevance of certain chapters to certain courses per se. But I think at the broader level, the question, I think, is the same question that generated the book, which is how is it that we can take the methods and the principles that have so effectively transformed the Baha'i community's work and expansion and consolidation and social action and various forms of public discourse and apply them to the world of intellectual life, of higher education, and it just is an open question. I think the more experiences we have that are really thought through, so they're kind of, their premises are clear, what they were trying to do is clear, that just allows the learning process to continue. And so, again, without knowing too intimately the workings of an institution like the Wilman Institute, I imagine that it provides a really wonderful opportunity for experimenting about, what it is to offer, courses of higher education, and how is the content produced, how does the courses, what are the courses that are offered, is there a coherent structure to those courses, what are the aims, what are the methods. I mean, it just seems like a really, really wonderful space of learning. And obviously, you're asking similar questions, but in a different context. And yeah, I think just like we can all learn from each other's experience, there's something to learn there.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned the application of the framework for teaching and consolidation in this book, and I was wondering if you could elaborate upon that. Exactly what aspects of the framework do you see that particularly influence the development of the book? I think you've covered this already, but I'm not sure that it may be clear to everybody. So
yeah, I mean, there are letters written by the Universal House of Justice, many of them that will explain this far better than I could explain it. And so I won't necessarily attempt a comprehensive account of anything. I'll just say sort of some of the things that might be relevant here, which is to say, on the one hand, there's sort of a central focus of the Baha'i community's work in expansion and consolidation is capacity building. It's not simply the kind of implementation of formula, sort of figuring out this is how it works, not everyone do the same thing. It's building certain capacities,
Right.
looking to build capacities and an expanding group of people who can then contribute to the transformation of their lives and their society and civilization at large. So in a way, what we were doing was, with this book, was also sort of a process of capacity building, building our own capacity, but also even thinking, well, what would the capacities be that a group of people engaged in intellectual inquiry need to develop in order to produce interesting content? And how do, through an experiment ourselves, do we do that? I think another characteristic that at least I've drawn from the work of expansion consolidation is the intimate relationship between action, reflection, consultation, and study. So it's not just we act, and then we sort of, I don't know what, some kind of magical breakthrough happens. Or it's not that we just sit and reflect and strategize and then we figure out the perfect method and implement it and then, everything changes. It's not just that we study the writings and we find this one passage that tells us what to do. It's those things together. You act sometimes without knowing exactly what you're doing, but you just have it seems like a reasonable thing to do. You reflect on what happened. You consult about it with others. What might be the next step? You study. You gain further insight. You just keep doing that systematically, and eventually you get somewhere. And you carry that out for long enough, and you really get somewhere. So the same thing with the book was we started. We reflected, we consulted, should we change things? Well, let's think about it. Let's reflect on kind of what's happened in the past. What are some examples of scholarship that's been effective? Let's try write something. Did it work? Does it seem like it sort of something's off? If so, let's start again, And it was a very kind of rigorous process, but it also was a very simple process that was just the same way that you're out in the neighborhood thinking, well, okay, what does it look like to start a junior youth group and this suburban area, or what does it look like to try to start a children's class, with when I've just moved to town and I don't really know people and there's a huge high-rise next to me, and what do I do? Or, what does it look like if I'm a university student that I know I'm only going to be here for 4 years? How do I contribute to the transformation of my community? Just the same sort of kinds of questions everyone asks when they're just thinking about how is it that we can bring more and more people into the civilization building activities of the Baha'i faith, just at the realm of scholarship and more kind of deliberate, systematic intellectual activity with a writing output.
Yeah, Steve had also asked, while there are many Baha'i institutions that grasp this learning, it's new to the rest of us. So that's one of the reasons why I felt I should ask this. An approach via discourse is quite different than the more traditional methods of learning. And I think that's a very useful point. We're really trying to create a consultative model for learning and for knowledge generation. And that's something a lot of people do, of course, but I think it's something we particularly are trying to do. This may be, this is from someone else named Alan. Please elaborate on the linkage between public discourse and the institute process, particularly with respect to capacity building.
Well, we actually thought about talking about this in the book, where there was a conversation on whether there should be a chapter that really looks at it. And you can actually see, if you look in the chapter 6, there are a few passages that mention this. And also in chapter 4, that's about education. If you look at the great philosophers, the public sphere and public discourse, from Habermas or John Dewey or others, they were very much talking about education and how is it that people become formed in a way that they can contribute to a kind of public conversation that is able to sustain certain forms of civilization. And so, for example, John Dewey, the reason he was so involved in education was because he thought, well, we have to have a body of people in order to have a well-functioning democratic society who are educated, who can think democratically, who can relate to other people democratically, who have a certain knowledge of the world, who have a certain experimental mindset. And this was his whole philosophy of public discourse in a democratic society. So, you can sort of detach those and think like, well, there's education working with like at very simple levels. Like, how is it that you work with very young children? What does that mean? Well, this isn't public discourse. But if you think of education as the forming of human beings and so that they can contribute to their civilization, and a large part of that happens through conversations, then the question of education becomes central. And so it just happens to be that over the years, the Baha'i community has found that among the various educational endeavors that have to happen, one important one is to really think about building capacity in, individuals and communities and institutions to contribute to sort of creating processes of transformation at neighborhoods and villages and expanding, range of areas with different age groups of children, of junior youth, of adults, and just sort of also different activities that become very normal. It's like this very sort of revving up of the engine of transformation in a way. Just like this is a core educational process that we've got to have. It has to happen. But obviously, there's a million things that have to happen. It's just that this is sort of one of these bricks upon which everything else really depends. But if you sort of look forward to, well, who are the people that are going to contribute to public discourse? And what would a kind of conversation look like amongst the people who have been formed by these educational processes? And how do new, more complex and sort of other educational processes emerge over time? I mean, this is a question the Wilmette Institute is thinking about, the Institute for Studies in Global Prosperity, the Association for Baha'i Studies. It's a huge question. It's one process. There are different layers to that process. But in the end, it's all about, preparing humans who can build a world order of Baha'i, whatever that looks like.
Some of these authors have published in other locations, in other sources, like Sona Arbab's published an entire book. Do you know how much the essays in this book are either shortened versions or related to some of the other publications these people have produced?
I would say that there are some of the chapters which would repeat arguments presented elsewhere, but all of them introduce new content. And most of the chapters are completely original.
Are completely original. Like, so for example, my chapter, part of the chapter is sort of presenting some ideas I published in my other book, 7 Ways of Looking at Religion, but framed in a completely new way and then connected to, a whole sort of aspect of the Baha'i writings and other fields of scholarship that I don't really touch upon in that book. And I think, for example, the chapter 4 on education, Sona Farid Arbab presented some of those arguments in her recent book on education. But it's presented in a way, articulated in a way that sort of brings some aspects of it to the fore, which wouldn't be so kind of concretely available anywhere else. But then like the work of Julia and Matt, and also the chapter by Sharia Razavi, like these are things that had never really been articulated in such a way before. Aspects of the history of the Baha'i faith, some principles that may have been sort of discussed among certain institutions or, sort of offices of public discourse, but to be presented in this way also brings them to the fore in a new light. So, yeah, the book, there is some part of it which will be arguments that maybe are available elsewhere, but those are always presented with new content and in a new light. And then at the same time, most of the chapters are really presenting content that has never really been seen before in such a setting. I was thinking, well, actually, no, we have some more questions here. Alan says, why did you decide not to discuss the implications of popular culture, in particular music? Sorry if I missed this earlier. So that was that suggestion. And someone else says the ebook is only $15.99. So that's another option for people if they don't want to spend $35.
I think Michael Kahlberg's chapter gets into questions of media. But I think part of it was just, it's like, there's a concept that's used in sort of other fields, the minimum effective dosage or minimum effective, force. And in a way, part of the book was looking for the minimum effective force, like what would get this thing going and not necessarily slow it down. So we weren't searching for comprehensiveness. It was just something that was good enough to get the ball rolling in a way. Obviously, balls are rolling, but just with a certain kind of, on this publication series, amongst a certain group of people who had been sort of vaguely thinking about various aspects of this, like, let's just get this started and see what happens. And obviously, like I said, there are a lot of really, really interesting topics that have to be considered. And, it just happened to be that also partially Jeff and I, as the editors, we knew certain people, we knew that, we could work well with them, that they were interested in this process, and we emailed them, and then we had enough authors for a book, and we just started. And I think with the knowledge that there's a lot more that others can and should do, and there's no claim to finality or completeness here.
I gather that 2 of the authors out of 10 are women. And are there any people of color involved as well? We wanted to ask about the whole question of the diversity of the various authors and the problem of balancing diversity in scholarship, because we can't always find authors who are able to give a good representative cross-section of the Baha'i community.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a sort of, I'm from the United States, but I've been living in Europe for about a decade, and I'm sort of wary when questions like this are raised because I don't quite know the stakes of everything happening in the U.S. and the kind of the academic discussion of these issues. But I think, yeah, obviously that's a concern, and I think there'll be a lot of really interesting reflections on the nature of diversity and how that is expressed in publications such as this. It's something I think we have to keep learning about.
Yeah, that's good. And let's see, that's the last of those questions. Could you say a little something about your chapter? Give people a sense of the content of at least one of the chapters.
Sure. I mean, so my chapter was, religion in an age of transition. And somehow it begins from this realization that, in a way, everyone recognizes that something is changing with religion in the world today. Religion, as it functions, today, 100 years ago, is not how it functioned 500 years ago, is not how it functioned 1,000 years ago, is not how it functioned 10,000 years ago, and won't be how it functions in another 1,000 years. So somehow religion is changing. But what are the characteristics of that change? What are the processes that shape that change? Where is the change coming from? Where is it going to? And what I did in that chapter was to realize that there's been for a while a very specific conversation about the nature of the change that's happening in religion in the modern world. And that's been largely articulated through what's called secularization theory, which is the idea that religion is undergoing a process of marginalization and decline. That somehow the more we learn about the world, the more powerful we become, the less religious we ought to be as well. But then particularly since the 1980s, and then going forward, it's just become more and more sort of clear. Scholars begin to recognize that, well, religion doesn't seem to be going away, even though modernizing processes are also advancing relentlessly throughout the world. So why is that? And if this classical vision of secularization isn't true, then what story of religious change or what story of religious history should we tell? So what I did in the chapter is to say, well, here are some of the main stories that people are presenting as alternatives to classical secularization theory. And for those who kind of are interested in really diving into this topic, my other WellMet Institute webinar, which is available on YouTube, goes through this argument in great depth, which I presented in my book, 7 Ways of Looking at Religion. But I can just sort of briefly say...
A great book, by the way.
Is that, for example, like a very obvious one, I'm not going to go through all 7 right here, but an obvious one is what I call the renewal narrative. So if you think of like most forms of fundamentalism or, certain kinds of conservatism, the idea is that, well, it's not that religion is, going away. It's actually that the problem is that secularism or some sort of, false or problematic modern society has emerged and has changed what actually is the true kind of religious way of living. And so the only way to solve the problems of the modern world is to renew our engagement with that older religious tradition or truth or orientation. So you understand this logic and suddenly see, well, that's the argument that is undergirding ISIS, and that's the argument that's undergirding, Hindu nationalism. That's the argument that's undergirding even like the sort of like romantic visions of like going back to, I don't know, some like native spirituality. It's not to say that it's wrong. It's just the logic is that we had this way that was better. Modernity corrupted it. We lost it. Now the way to solve the problems of the modern world is to renew it. That logic can appear in 1,000 different ways. Or another one of the arguments represented is the perennial narrative, which is that throughout history and around the world, religion has, you see sort of the same things happening with religion. So you might say there's some universal essence that all religions are expression of the mysterium tremendum, or maybe there's this sort of cycle of the rise and fall of religions that happens perennially throughout history. Or maybe we just have this one existential flaw and it keeps repeating itself and religion is trying to sort of resolve that. And there's just these stories that say, well, whatever religion is, it's one thing. We're seeing 1,000 different manifestations of that one thing. Maybe you say, well, there's this one higher mystical path and all the religions are instantiations or ways onto that higher truth. It's just this perenniality of eternal or recurring. And then the last one I end up with is this idea of development, that throughout history and around the world, religion has been undergoing a process of development that can be described in terms of certain stages. It doesn't necessarily have to be described like that, but you can. And so you say, well, there was a certain stage in which, the kind of patterns of we might call tribal religious life that are more focused on ritual. That was the main sort of form of religion. And then you have settled agrarian sort of urban civilizations and a new, much more kind of mythic civilization in which there's like a state and more kind of forms of ritual that are performed on behalf of other people. And there's like a common framework that expands over a civilization. And then you get what some call like this period when like religions of the book emerge, where there's a text and you can take the text with you when you travel from Greece to India and you can still practice and you can still think and believe in a certain way. Whereas if you left Egypt, you were just out of that religion. It wasn't there anymore. You were not in the territory. Or if you left your tribe or something like that. And then somehow there's something that begins to happen with modernity. When, how, what, but somehow that form of the classic religions of the book, which basically, went all the way up through Islam, all the way up into the modern period, and then now we're in something sort of new. And since then, it's just been in a state of kind of turmoil and upheaval and constant transformation. So the question then is like, well, if you see from a developmental perspective, you would say, well, we're actually probably transitioning from one stage of religious history to the next. It's just not clear what the next thing is going to be yet. And I think that's a very concrete and defensible scholarly proposition. And then what I start to do is we'll say, well, let's look at two ways of thinking about that and framing such a story. And one is this discourse on the axial age, which is a scholarly story, which basically says, well, if we look at the middle centuries of the first millennium BCE, we see that Greek philosophy, Hebrew prophecy, Buddhism, Upanishadic Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Confucianism, Taoism, they're all appearing around the same time and doing something similar. So maybe we can then imagine that, I don't know, at these moments of civilizational transition, there's some kind of collective spiritual transformation that's possible. And what if in the period of globalization that we're witnessing, what if something like that is happening again and we just don't know what it's going to look like ultimately? Mm-hmm. And then I sort of say, well, you take this kind of a story and then look at the vision of religious history that appears in the Baha'i writings. And obviously it's not a scholarly argument. It's not sort of a developmental narrative in the classic sense, but it does emphasize certain processes of development. And it does tell a story about progressive revelation. It emphasizes certain stages of religious history less and more the coming of independent manifestations of God. But you just start to see how, well, there's a conversation happening in academia about kind of around the idea of the axial age or other visions of like a developmental path of religious history. There's this other conversation in the Baha'i faith, these other teachings that are emerging that operate with very different epistemic framework. They're doing something, their goal is to transform humanity, not to just make like a concrete scholarly argument. But still there's a possibility of meaningful conversation, mutual illumination. ongoing discourse. And you can just see how somewhere this academic conversation on religion and somehow the conversation on religious history and the Baha'i faith, there's at least sort of like a growing into like a space where a meaningful conversation could happen. And that's sort of what I argue that is what I argue in the chapter. And I think that's interesting for a book on religion and public discourse because, again, the whole nature of the public discourse takes shape within sort of a sense of what's happening in the world today. You only have a discourse on the environment because you have a sense that, well, there was industrialization, we've been consuming more producing more greenhouse gases than is ultimately sustainable, something is transforming, that's threats the sort of existence of humanity, we need to change that. Well, that's science, but it's also a story of history, and that story frames the discourse on the environment. And in the same way that the discourse on religion and society is framed by various stories of history, I just sort of analyze those stories and think, well, what if we told this kind of a story as opposed to that kind of a story?
Yeah, I'm very, very appreciative of the work you did on the 7 ways of looking at religion. I read Robert Bella's essay on the evolution of religion many years ago, and he originally published that in the 1950s. Of course, his book elaborated on it quite a bit. But that was, I found, particularly persuasive, and it sort of opened the door to looking at progressive revelation from a sociological point of view. What Bella couldn't do, of course, is figure out what was going on today. And in fact, in his 1950s essay, you might say he almost gave up and talked about postmodern religion, not in the sense of postmodernity today, the way we use the term. So I'm very appreciative that you've sort of built on him and perhaps filled in a blank there in the current period of time. So that why I found your research particularly useful. One person here, Alan, says, are there other Baha'is who are involved in the academy and public discourse who are trying to build on this analysis of religion?
I think there are, there's various ways in which influence happens. There's the sort of the direct and the indirect. So hopefully people who read this book, it shapes their sense of, how they can write and talk about religion. But it may also be that the way I've just approached my subject matter they find interesting and useful as a sort of a framework. So I know of one guy who's doing a PhD right now who's at least sort of, thought about some of the methodological approaches that I take, how to frame a kind of such an analysis, but in a very different sort of field. And the concept of narrative isn't necessarily the one that he finds the most useful, but it's sort of, he's talking about moral education. So it's the kind of ideal person or the kind of the figure who is sort of imagined as the sort of the kind of moral person that you're trying to educate young people into becoming. So you can do a typology of, well, who are the moral figures in the discourse on education? I think there's another person who, is maybe looking at some of the arguments more specifically that I make. But then again, it's not like, I make no pretensions to being like some foundational thinker or anything. I'm just trying to generate some interesting stuff, and I hope people find it interesting. And
I think a lot of people have found it foundational too. One more question here. Alan asks, are you trying to eliminate false dichotomies? And I leave you to figure out that one.
Yeah, I would say like my favorite thing to do is to eliminate false dichotomies. And the reason is because they beset me all the time. But it's just somehow when I do them, I don't know, I feel like this sense of relaxation. It's as if I get personally troubled when I feel things don't seem to resonate in my mind. So I just sort of existentially have to kind of unravel that. And so, yeah, in a way, a lot of it is just looking at this. I looked at this sort of discourse on religion, and all these people are sort of speaking past each other, and no one is really having the same conversation, and then people are making arguments that don't seem to kind of hit home with each other. And I just feel like there's something happening here that's just really muddled, and there's no clarity about what's happening. So let me just kind of figure out the structure of that discourse. And, I think to a certain extent, I've got it. Obviously, there's specificities that I don't know, But I feel like the logic of it now, nothing has surprised me since then in a way, in terms of the logic, the narrative stories that I encounter. Not saying that there couldn't be other things, but at least in the current conversation, I felt like, yeah, I did sort of get some clarity about that. But then, that's just one thing. And then there's just a million other things that have to be done. And so now it's kind of like, all right, well, let's take a look at this axial age theory, which is, in my mind, one of the most robust sort of alternatives to classical secularization theory. It's very popular. It's very bold. It's very ambitious. It says things that I find really interesting and exciting and surprising. And it also has a certain resonance with the Baha'i teachings, which obviously are speaking in a different context, but nevertheless, I find that compelling. So then I want to say, well, let's look at this discourse as not just a story about the middle centuries of the first millennium BCE, but as a story of world history, which is meant to position us with a vision toward the future to do something different with human civilization.
Yep.
And so how we think about a story that has that practical purpose, that practical ambition of empowering the possibility of the creation of a new global civilization, but still wants to be as empirically accurate as it can be, but also knows that as part of such a story, you have to say stuff that usually can't be directly falsified or confirmed by just kind of narrow empirical historical analysis. So it's like gets into the stage of philosophy of history, of these framing narratives, and there's a real rigor and sophistication to that that I think in the contemporary academy for many years hasn't gotten enough attention, and is now starting to get more attention of the role of these big framing narratives, that we can't get rid of them, we have to use them. And so maybe actually the tools of philosophy are things we need to apply to thinking about them.
Yeah, as you say, classical secularization theory has been the sort of dominant, in the past, was the dominant theory for the nature of religion and its role in the world. And that's clearly become increasingly problematic. The question then is what to replace it with. So you have this plethora of other understandings. And I didn't realize that, well, I guess I had realized that you weren't the only person talking about the issue of a new axial age. But admittedly, it's an awfully flexible model, since you can pour practically anything into it.
Sure.
A very large number of things in it.
Yeah, and I just also sort of say, it's like, I don't necessarily believe in this axial age theory. I just find it very compelling, and I want to think through it all the way and see what its strengths and limitations are. I mean, it's a construction of the human mind. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but it means it's finite and limited and inevitably, not the entire truth. But to kind of go to the point where I can see clearly its strengths and its limitations, I'm really interested to sort of, how I'll be able to think a lot more clearly once I've done that about issues that I think are important.
Yeah, it's a whole model to try and utilize to make sense out of the world, and it's got a lot of potential, that's for sure. Alan asks whether there's a particularly most effective strategy for eliminating false dichotomies in daily conversations. Not sure how easy it is to tackle that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think my most effective strategy is to learn how to get existentially bothered by the feeling of dichotomies in your mind, and then being sort of obsessively compelled to figure them out and then to root them out. And that's, it's not like a positive strategy. I find them really unappealing,
Stephen, go ahead.
No, that's it. I don't like them. They're ugly. I want ugly things. Ugly thoughts need to depart my mind, because then I feel.
Stephen asks about the 7 Ways book and whether it refers to the axial age theory. And in a sense, I'm asking for good references for this ongoing conversation.
Yeah, the book does mention it as sort of one of the kinds of developmental narratives that are being put forth as alternatives to classical secularization theory.
Particularly to the end of the book, it seems to me, in the epilogue.
Yeah, that's the 7th chapter, and then also the conclusion. I sort of use the language a bit. I think if one's looking for references, the book by Karl Jaspers, who's a German philosopher, in which he first presented this axial age thesis, is The Origin and Goal of History. published in German in 1949, in English, I think, in 1951, sort of in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. He's trying to just say, like, well, somehow we have to transform our very understanding of who we are as a human race if we're going to avoid the kind of insanity that just happened in these world wars. Another really cool book that was published right afterward by Lewis Mumford, who's a very influential American sort of urban planner and philosopher of sort of urban philosopher in a way, is Lewis Mumford, and he wrote this book called The Transformation of Man, which I find to be just one of the most astounding books I've read. When I discovered it, it was just like the things he says about kind of the future and about history and the needs of the present. I mean, for anyone familiar with the Baha'i writings and some of the kind of more recent kind of guidance and thought patterns and sort of things that we're trying to do, it's as if more than anyone else, he kind of understood the imperative of transforming the really like lived fabric of civilization, not just, thought and ideas and political orders, but like the way we live, the way we relate to each other, the way we interact with each other, the way our cities work, like our balance between work and sort of, earning money, and just all those little sort of intangibles that often philosophers don't think too much about. He just offered this incredible vision of that. And then he used this idea of the axial age. And basically what he said, which was different than what Jasper said, was that this kind of archaic period where like you have ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, and he sort of says you can look at that structure and you expand it to the Aztecs, it's, the sort of early Chinese civilization. He called them these mega machines. And he said one of the things that they did was they were the first real technological, like massive kind of technological breakthroughs where like urban civilization was established. These could be seen as like these moments of astounding technological breakthrough. But the way that they did it was basically by mechanizing human life. It's like the actual technological instruments that the Egyptians used, for example, were quite simple. But it was really the sort of attempt to turn humans into like a labor machine, into sort of this technically managed sort of, mass that could then be used to build something like the pyramids. And he saw this happen in all of the kind of early civilizations. And he says that for him, the axial age was this kind of spiritual revolt against this excessive mechanization of human life and trying to humanize humans and to say they have this transcendent, irreducible, noble, dignified spiritual content that can't be mechanized. It has to be protected against that. It has to be cultivated, a new form of civilization that recognizes it. So in a way, he says, Greek philosophy, Hebrew prophecy, Buddhism, classical Chinese thought, they're all sort of doing this in a way. And so for him, the second axial age is, again, like this sort of resonant kind of, rehumanization against this overwhelming force of technological mechanization. And so he, just a few years after Jasper's he had said something similar in earlier books, but then sort of picks up Jasper's idea and takes it in a slightly new direction.
And this is what, the 1950s, right?
This is in the 1950s, yeah. Eric Voegelin wrote this book, Order and History. It's a 5-volume book. Volume 4, The Ecumenic Age, is another one. After that, the other kind of, there's a couple other books, but one of my favorites is another just completely mind-blowingly brilliant book, is The Venture of Islam by Marshall Hodgson.
Yeah.
And he basically says that we need to look at Islam not just as sort of like this Middle Eastern religion, but in many ways as the culmination of the entire axial age that began in the middle centuries of the first millennium BC. It's like all of the potentialities that begin to emerge culminated in the civilization of Islam, and then sort of somehow when you get to this transition to modernity, which he places more and more even to like the 19th century, that's the period when, in a way, this kind of axial stage of civilization that began, so long before comes to a close and something new begins. But, and then he said, well, it's still unclear where this new thing is going. But yeah, it's just an amazing way of looking at Islam. Well,
right.
There's just more. There's so many really cool books on it, and that was one of the reasons I got interested in it. It's like if you sort of judge an idea by its fruits, axial age theorists just come up with really cool books and good ideas that seem to be very productive in other ways. And so somehow it's just like this idea, like it's at least productive. It's at least generating good thought. So that sort of signifies that there's something there. As opposed to other things, they use an idea, and every time it just sort of smells funky. It's like, I'm not interested in that idea. It's just not generating really interesting work. So I don't know, there's something about that. You sort of, I don't know, Nietzsche always joked that he was a philosopher who, you know, the quality of his philosophical work was based on the strength of his nose. And somehow it's sort of like, you can carry these fields, and you're like, this just smells really cool. I like it, and it's interesting. And he's dig into it, like, yeah, there's something there. And you reach others, you're like, no, this, I don't even know what it is, but it's just not worth digging into. The actual theory has a bit of wonkiness, but it always just generates really cool and interesting stuff.
Yeah. One person says if you could write down this list, we'll put it up on our website of books people might want to look at. And Gary asked this interesting question. Could you relate in any way this concern about mechanization back in the pre-axial age with the current situation with digitization, robotization, and AI? And whether we aren't encountering a similar kind of fear today?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of philosophers of technology, you know, there's a few, and I think if you go back to this kind of, in a way, like these people like Louis Mumford who are writing in the 50s and even before, like Jacques Ellul, he's a French sociologist. In a way, they actually offered a lot of better critiques of technology than some of the modern philosophers, partially because they sort of saw it at this civilizational level and critiqued it in a very deep way, where somehow now people are much more just kind of at the surface level, like they're so immersed in it that it's more like just sort of analyzing particularities. But anyway, I think Louis Mumford's analysis, to me, even though it's a stimulating analogy, it's still very stimulating, which is to say, that's really interesting. Like if we somehow just draw an analogy between like ancient Egypt and like contemporary sort of Western civilization, which is to say like Egypt was glorious, you know, I mean, the technology, the sort of infrastructure, the buildings, the arts, the culture, but it was also brutal. And so you can sort of see that ambiguity that we face today, that this, yeah, I mean, obviously like modern Western civilization is deeply impressive, and it's, you know, it's done a lot of astounding things, but it also is just sort of, it's crazy. And so like that sort of, that dual sense of like somehow this technology thing has just gone berserk, and this whole worshiping of power and kind of just like power for power's sake, and it's just something that we lose human nature and we become just these sort of, yeah, material, sort of spiritless sort of, you know, vessels for consumption or just labor, and we labor so we can consume more. It's insane. And then you start to just think, well, yeah, at some point, you know, if people threw this stuff off before, and often it was happening through these like the great religions, it seems pretty plausible that at a certain point humanity is going to be like, yeah, we're not doing this anymore. And, you know, I think as Baha'is, like, absolutely, that we think that that's what has to happen. It's obviously a more complex story, but that's a big part of the story. Yeah.
Very good. Well, I want to thank you very much for this fascinating conversation, especially I think the last half an hour people have been asking lots of questions. We went off and tapped a different vein in mine, and it generated some particularly interesting reactions from our audience. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for this discussion of the book on religion and public discourse.